There's a place off the coast of Queensland where the water is so clear you can see the reef from 30 meters up. On a good day, a really good day, the color is almost unreal. Blue that doesn't look like water, it looks like light. For decades, developers looked at that and saw something else entirely. They saw an opportunity. Remote islands, pristine water, wealthy tourists willing to pay almost anything for the feeling that they'd found the edge of the world. So they built. They cleared land and poured concrete and strung fairy lights between palm trees and called it paradise. Some of those resorts made fortunes. Some of them became icons. And some of them, well, some of them are still out there right now, sitting empty in the heat, roofs caving in, swimming pools full of rainwater and leaves. The ocean still right there, indifferent, going about its business. This is about those places, not just what happened to them, but what they were trying to be, and why that turned out to be impossible. Great Keppel sits about 50 kilometers off the coast near Yeppoon. Not the most remote island on this list, not the most dramatic. But for a generation of Australians who grew up in the 70s and 80s, it had a reputation. "Get wrecked on Keppel" was the actual marketing slogan, which tells you something about what they were selling. Sun, sand, affordable fun. It wasn't trying to be Hayman, it was trying to be accessible, and for a long time, it worked. The resort ran for decades. Families, backpackers, couples. The kind of place that shows up in someone's holiday photos with a slightly faded quality. Everyone squinting at the camera with a beer in hand. It closed in 2008. The owner, a company called Tower Holdings, had plans. Big plans. A full redevelopment. Hundreds of millions of dollars, villas and spas, and the whole transformation from budget destination to luxury resort. The permits were applied for. The concept renders were produced. The existing buildings were left empty while everyone waited for approval. The approval never came. The global financial crisis hit. The redevelopment stalled. And then it just stayed stalled. For years. More than a decade of announcements and delays and fresh promises, and then more silence. What's left on Great Keppel now is the husk of a resort waiting for a future that isn't coming. Buildings deteriorating quietly. A jetty that's seen better days. The vegetation doing what vegetation does when you leave it alone in a subtropical climate. The strange thing about Great Keppel isn't the ruin. It's the waiting. Everything was left in a state of anticipation, as if someone paused the tape and forgot to press play again. Wilson Island is tiny. That's the first thing you need to understand. It's a coral cay, just a thin strip of sand and casuarina trees sitting on top of a reef, not much bigger than a few football fields. It shouldn't have a resort on it at all, really. The fact that it ever had permanent structures says something about how far developers were willing to push. At its peak, Wilson Island offered a small number of permanent tents, glamping before glamping had a name, 6 or 8 guests at a time, maximum. The pitch was radical exclusivity. You're not just on an island, you're on the island. No day trippers, no noise, just you and a patch of sand in the middle of the coral sea. The structures were always semi-temporary by design. But what's happened since the resort's operations became increasingly precarious is different. The island itself has started shifting. Coral cays are not stable landforms. They move. Storms reshape them. What was solid ground a decade ago isn't necessarily solid ground now. Some of the platform structures that guests slept on are half buried. Some are listing at angles that weren't in the original blueprints. The island is in the process of slowly reclaiming what was placed on it. The way sand reclaims anything that sits still long enough. It's one of the few places on this list where you feel like nature isn't being dramatic about it. There's no violent collapse, just a quiet, steady erasure. Orpheus is in the Palm Islands group, roughly 80 kilometers north of Townsville. It's surrounded by some of the best preserved inshore reefs in the entire Great Barrier Reef system, which is exactly why a research station from James Cook University has been there for decades, studying marine life. The lodge that operated alongside it was, for a period, the kind of place that showed up in travel magazines with phrases like understated elegance and one of Australia's best-kept secrets. Small, quiet, Expensive in the way things are expensive when they're also genuinely beautiful. It closed. It reopened under new management. It closed again. The cycle of ownership changes and operational struggles that plays out across almost every resort on this list. Orpheus went through its own version of it, and what each change left behind was a slightly more tired version of what had been there before. What makes Orpheus worth including here isn't spectacular ruin. It's the gap between what the island actually is, ecologically remarkable, genuinely rare, and the difficulty of building anything commercially sustainable on top of that. The reef around Orpheus has survived better than many. The human infrastructure above the waterline has had a harder time of it. From the air, Long Island looks almost too green. Dense tropical vegetation right to the waterline, the kind of canopy that suggests something old and undisturbed. Palm Bay sits on the western side, sheltered, the resort buildings half hidden by trees that have been growing for a long time. Palm Bay was never a grand resort. It was a budget destination, deliberately low-key, the kind of place that attracted people who wanted to actually be in the Whitsundays rather than just look at them from a pool deck. Camping areas, basic cabins, a beach bar. The isolation was the point. But isolation cuts both ways. When cyclone seasons came, when bookings dipped, when the economics of running a remote resort started tightening, there was no buffer. No mainland infrastructure to fall back on. Every supply run cost money. Every staff member had to be housed. The margins that work on the mainland don't automatically work on an island. Palm Bay closed. The vegetation that was always pressing against the buildings started winning. What visitors who occasionally pass by on boats describe now is something swallowed rather than abandoned. The jungle didn't wait for permission. It just moved back in. The trees look like they've been there forever. In a few decades, you might not be able to tell they haven't. South Maule was one of the original Great Barrier Reef resort islands. It had been operating in various forms since the 1920s, which is remarkable, really, when you think about what the Whitsundays looked like in 1920. No highways, no airports, no tourist infrastructure of any kind. Just determined early operators who saw something in those islands and decided to bet on it. By the 80s and 90s, South Maule was a mid-market resort with a golf course and a tennis court and regular ferry services from Chute Harbour. It was never the flashiest destination in the Whitsundays. It didn't need to be. It had consistency. Decades of guests who came back, brought their kids kids. Cyclone Uluwi hit in 2010, and after Uluwi came the decisions, repair or walk away. The owners walked away. What's left on South Maule now is striking in a way that's hard to fully convey in words. The buildings are intact. The golf course is still there in outline. The fairway's just grassland now. The resort infrastructure, bar, reception, accommodation blocks, is standing. Just empty. Just quiet. There's something particularly unsettling about a place that looks like it should still be open. A ruin is one thing. A building that still has all its bones is another. South Maule looks less like something that collapsed and more like something that was simply vacated. As if everyone left in a hurry one afternoon and nobody came back. Lindemann was Club Med. That's important context, because Club Med didn't just run resorts. Club Med sold a specific idea of what a holiday could be. International clientele, structured activities, a certain glossy self-containedness. When Club Med put a resort somewhere, it was a statement. They came to Lindemann in the Whitsundays in the 1990s and built accordingly. The resort had capacity for hundreds of guests, entertainment facilities, a children's club, the full Club Med apparatus transplanted to an island off the Queensland coast. It closed in 2012. Club Med cited the GFC and changing market conditions. The resort had been struggling for years before that. The isolation that sounds appealing in a brochure becomes a logistical challenge at scale. Getting hundreds of guests in and out of a remote island every week costs money in ways that mainland resorts don't have to worry about. What's on Lindemann now is one of the most complete abandoned resort complexes in Australia. The buildings are largely intact. There are still furnishings inside some of them. The pool is still structurally there, just empty, the tiles cracking slowly in the heat. Photographs taken by people who visited show a peculiar kind of stillness, like a resort that's been frozen mid-operation. Glasses still on shelves, signage still pointing guests toward facilities they can't use. A fully formed world, just without anyone in it. Various redevelopment proposals have come and gone. An eco-resort concept, a Chinese investment group. Each time, news articles, renderings, optimism, and then nothing. Lindemann sits and waits. The Whitsunday Sun does what it does to anything left unattended. This one is different from everything else on this list. Not a resort, not accommodation, just a structure. A cylinder of steel and glass dropped into the water off the southern tip of Hook Island in 1974, allowing visitors to descend below the surface and watch the reef through porthole windows. At the time, it was genuinely innovative. Snorkeling was for the able-bodied and the confident. This let anyone, kids, older visitors, people who'd never been near the ocean, get below the surface without getting wet. The reef visible through those windows in 1974 was extraordinary, healthy staghorn coral. Schools of fish so thick the water darkened. The observatory closed in 2016. The reef had changed by then. Years of bleaching events had taken their toll on the coral visible through those windows, and the draw, the spectacle of a living reef, was diminished. Why pay to look through a porthole at something increasingly gray and sparse when snorkeling above it told the same story for free? The structure is still anchored there, steel corroding slowly in salt water. The windows still intact, looking out at a reef that isn't what it was. It's hard to think of a more precise physical metaphor for what's happened to the Great Barrier Reef. A device built specifically to show people the reef's beauty, now sitting empty, looking out at something that isn't quite there anymore. Daydream has a complicated history, even by the standards of this list. It's been a resort in various forms since the 1930s, which makes it one of the oldest in the Whitsundays. Different owners, different eras, different visions of what the island should be. There are layers of infrastructure on Daydream that span decades, older structures sitting beneath newer ones, the island carrying the physical weight of a century of tourism. The most recent major resort was a significant redevelopment completed in 2019. Yes, 2019. A genuine attempt to bring the island into the modern era. Open-air lagoon, living reef installation, contemporary design. The investment was real and the ambition was serious. And then COVID. The resort closed in 2020, along with everything else, and the subsequent reopening was partial, complicated, financially strained. The story of Daydream's most recent chapter isn't fully written yet, but the pattern is visible. The cycle of investment, disruption, and uncertainty that has defined this island for 90 years hasn't broken. What makes Daydream haunting isn't the ruin of it. Some of the newest structures are still in decent condition. What's haunting is the accumulation. The sense that this island has been the site of human ambition repeatedly, that each generation built its version of paradise here, and that the island just keeps absorbing it all, the old structures disappearing under the new ones, and then the new ones going quiet in their own time. Brampton sits in the Mackay region, south of the Whitsundays proper, surrounded by a marine park with some genuinely remarkable fringing reef. It was a resort for a long time, decades of operation under different owners, the kind of island that appeared in holiday guides as a quieter alternative to the Whitsundays. Cyclone Uli in 2010 hit Brampton hard. The resort closed for repairs, and the repairs never came. The owners, Virgin Limited Edition, had already been reviewing the viability of the operation before the storm. Uli gave them a reason to stop. The island was subsequently acquired with plans for ecotourism redevelopment. Those plans moved slowly. Meanwhile, Brampton's former resort infrastructure deteriorated in the way that tropical buildings deteriorate when nobody maintains them, which is to say, aggressively and thoroughly. What's striking about Brampton now is how quickly the island reasserted itself. staff housing overtaken by vegetation. The old resort gardens, which were maintained and manicured for years, reverting to something wilder and denser. Wildlife that had been displaced by resort activity returning. In a strange way, Brampton, after the resort, is more ecologically interesting than Brampton during it. The reef in the surrounding marine park is among the better preserved in the region. The fringing reef that guests use to snorkel over is still there, still functioning, still supporting marine life. The resort is gone. The reef isn't. That's not the story this video tells about every island on the list. Hayman is a different scale entirely. This was never a budget destination, never a family resort, never trying to appeal to anyone who needed to think carefully about the price. Hayman was positioned, explicitly and deliberately, as one of the finest resort experiences in the Southern Hemisphere. The Intercontinental Hayman Island Resort that opened in 1987 was the result of a reported $300 million redevelopment by Alan Bond. Yes, that Alan Bond in his years of extravagance before everything came apart. The scale was extraordinary. 1,000-meter freshwater pool, ballrooms, helicopter transfers, guest lists that included royalty, heads of state, film stars. Hayman wasn't selling a Great Barrier Reef holiday. It was selling the idea that you had arrived, that you were the kind of person who stayed at Hayman. Cyclone Debbie in 2017 struck Hayman with particular ferocity. The damage was extensive. The resort closed for a complete rebuild. 2 years, hundreds of millions of dollars, and a relaunch in 2019 as Intercontinental Hayman Island. And then COVID. The resort that reopened after COVID is not quite the same place that existed before. The bones are there. The location is still extraordinary. The island itself doesn't care about its ownership history. But Hayman carries now the weight of what it cost to keep running it, the disruption of back-to-back crises, and the question hanging over every ultra-luxury remote resort. At what point does the isolation stop being the selling point and start being the liability? Hayman is not a ruin. Not yet, maybe not ever. But the version of Hayman that Alan Bond built in 1987, that particular expression of Australian money and ambition, that's gone. What's operating now is something more careful, more contingent. There's something in that, even if it's harder to photograph. Off the far north Queensland coast, about 4 kilometres from the town of Mission Beach, sits an island that should, by almost any measure, be operating. It has infrastructure. It has an airstrip. It has decades of operational history going back to the 1930s. It was, at various points, one of the most beloved resort islands in Australia, not because it was the most expensive or the most exclusive, but because it was genuinely, unmistakably beautiful. Edmund Banfield lived on Dunk Island for over 20 years in the early 20th century and wrote Confessions of a Beachcomber, a book that described the island as a place of almost incomprehensible natural richness. The reef around Dunk, the rainforest interior, the bird life. Banfield made Dunk Island famous before there was a resort there at all. The resort that grew up over the following decades leaned into that. Not the flashiest destination, not the most expensive, just beautiful, real. The kind of place that people who'd been there once came back to without needing to think about it. Cyclone Yasi hit in February 2011, Category 5. One of the most intense cyclones to make landfall in Queensland's recorded history. Dunk Island took a direct hit. The damage was catastrophic. Almost every building on the island was either destroyed or rendered structurally compromised. The resort had employed around 250 people. In the days after Yasi, they had no jobs, and the island they'd worked on looked like something from a different world. Twisted metal, uprooted trees, structures simply gone. Recovery operations began, and then stalled. Dunk Island has passed through the hands of multiple owners since 2011. Proposals have been floated, investigated, announced, and quietly abandoned. More than a decade after Yasi, the resort infrastructure on Dunk Island is still sitting there in various states of destruction and overgrowth. But here's what makes Dunk different from every other island on this list. The reef surrounding Dunk Island was already struggling before Yasi. The bleaching events of 2016 and 2017, the worst in recorded history, the ones that killed roughly half the shallow water corals on the northern Great Barrier Reef. Those events affected the waters around Dunk severely. The reef that Banfield described that made the island what it was, that the resort existed to give guests access to, that reef is not what it was. In some sections, it is not there at all. So you have an island with no functioning resort, and you have a reef that cannot be what it was. Any proposal to rebuild on Dunk Island is a proposal to rebuild a resort that sells access to something that no longer exists in the form that made it worth selling. The economics were never going to work. The ecology had already moved. The resort buildings sit in the heat. The vegetation is doing what vegetation does. And out in the water, where the reef used to be in all the photographs, in all the old promotional materials, in Banfield's writing, the water is there, clear, warm, beautiful in its way, but quieter than it should be, emptier than it looks. Dunk Island isn't just a resort that was abandoned. It's a resort that became impossible. There's a difference. And the further you go into this list, the more places you find where that distinction is the only honest one left. These 11 resorts were built on the assumption that what made them possible, the water, the reef, the extraordinary biological spectacle just below the surface, was permanent, that it was a given, that you could build above it and sell it, and it would just keep being there. What's left of those resorts now is a kind of answer to that assumption. Steel going back to rust, concrete going back to rubble, the reef doing something far more complicated, far slower, and in some places, irreversible. The Great Barrier Reef is not dead. That's important to say, but it's not what it was, and the rate of change is not slowing. The honest version of that is hard to look at, harder, maybe, than a roofless resort block with a tree growing through the middle of it, at least the ruin you can photograph, at least the ruin you can point to and say, something was here. The other loss is quieter. It happens underwater, in increments, in water temperatures measured by instruments most people will never see. It doesn't make for photographs, the way an abandoned resort does. But it's the same story. It was always the same story.